So recall that we could study bones from two perspectives. We could study bone as a tissue or bony tissue, or we could study bones as organs. That is, we could consider the bony tissue along with the other structures that are associated with them, like blood vessels, nerves, and things like that. So we've covered bony tissue in a previous lecture segment, so here we're going to look at whole bones as organs. Now, bones of the human body are actually quite variable in terms of their size. The smallest bones of the skeleton on the left here are found in the middle ear, and what these bones do is that they connect the eardrum or the tympanic membrane to the sensory structure of the ear, which is called the cochlea. And so these bones don't function in body support, but instead they're part of one of the special sensory systems, which is hearing. The longest bones of the human body are the femurs, which are in upwards of about 2 feet or so in length, and they are the major weight-bearing bone of the lower limb. So their function is to support body weight and transmit it to the lower limbs. Right. Whole bones are categorized in one of 4 different shapes: short, flat, irregular, or long bones. So let's take a look at short bones and what those are. Short bones are bones that are roughly cube shaped. That is, they're approximately equal in all dimensions. Most short bones are actually confined to the wrists and the ankles. So collectively the wrist bones are known as the carpals. Collectively the bones of the ankle are known as the tarsals. And so these are generally where the short bones are found in the human skeleton. We also have special types of short bones called sesamoid bones, and sesamoid bones are special short bones that develop within some, but not many, of the tendons in the body. And the reason that they develop in the tendons is that these bones actually help protect the tendons across that particular joint. And so one example of this is the patella, which forms the kneecap, that helps protect this large tendon that crosses the anterior part of the knee joint here. The patella also actually helps give a little bit of leverage to this patellar tendon here, and helps really kind of position the tendon so it's in a better position, so that the muscles that are up here in the anterior part of the thigh can deliver better forces to the tibia or the shin bone here, and provide kind of better movement there across that joint. But the patella primarily is a protective bone that helps to prevent wear and tear damage to that tendon that crosses the knee joint there. So those are sesamoid bones. They're cube-shaped bones that develop within a few, but not a whole lot, of the tendons in our body. So those kind of a rare type of bone in the body, if you will. We also have the flat bones, which are, as their name implies, they are generally thin bones, but they're also sometimes curved. And a couple of good examples of this are things like the sternum. Surprisingly, the ribs are flat bones because they are compressed in a single direction, so they are flattened bones with a pretty good curve associated with them. So the rib bones are probably the most curved of the flat category of bones. The scapula, which are the shoulder blades, are also considered flat bones. And many of the cranial bones, which are the bones that directly surround and protect the brain, are considered flat bones. So things like the frontal bone, which is the bone that's on the anterior part of the skull, the parietal bones, which kind of sit in the top middle part of the skull, the occipital bone, all of these are considered flat bones. So these are thin bones with a slight curvature to them as well. Now, irregular bones are bones that are not really easily classifiable in any of the shapes that we've discussed so far. So these would be things like the vertebra, which have a very unique shape to them, as well as bones like the sphenoid bone. And the sphenoid bone is actually a cranial bone. It's not a flat bone within the cranium. It's categorized as an irregular bone because of its very characteristic and unique shape that it has to it. So those are some examples of irregular bones. So these are just bones whose shape is not easily classifiable by any of the standards we've looked at so far. Last but not least, we have the long bones, and I save these for last because we kind of look at some structures of these using an example long bone, and so I saved the long bones here for last. As their name implies, long bones are longer than they are wide, and they are generally located in the limbs, and these are the bones that give length to the limbs themselves. And so long bones would be, for example, the femur bone in the thigh as an example of a long bone. The bones that make up the leg and the forearm, right? So remember, the leg is the region that's between the knee and the ankle. And so these are the two leg bones here. This is the tibia, and that's the fibula. The radius, the ulna and the radius here, these are the bones that make up the forearm. And remember, the forearm is the region that's between the elbow joint and the wrist joint here. And so these are the two parallel bones that make up the forearm here. Also, the bones that make up the palm and the fingers and the plantar surface of the foot and the toes as well are also considered long bones. So these are all bones that are longer than they are wide. So using our long bone as an example, let's look at some of the surface structures and features of long bones, and we can also apply some of those surface structures and features to other bones as well, because they're not just found in long bones, they're found in other bones as well. The book just so happens to use the example of a long bone to demonstrate some of these structures and features. So let's look at the structure of a typical long bone. The bone that they've selected here is actually the humerus, which is the main bone of the arm, which is between the shoulder joint. So the shoulder joint would be up here, and the elbow joint would be down here. So this is the humerus, which is the bone that makes up your arm. So long bones typically have two ends, two expanded ends, I should say, called the epiphyses. Now, the epiphyses generally have a shell of compact bone on their outer surface, on their external surface, and internally they're generally filled with spongy bone. Since long bones are found in the limbs, one of these epiphyses is proximally located. So in this example, because this is the humerus, this would be the end of the humerus that makes up the shoulder joint here. And the other epiphysis is a distal epiphysis. And because this is, again, a humerus bone, this would be the epiphysis that makes up the elbow joint here. So that's the most distal part of the humerus there. Now, between these two epiphyses is a shaft region called the diaphysis. Now, the diaphysis is a tubular portion of bone that connects these two epiphyses. The walls of the diaphysis are typically thickened with compact bone, and there's generally a very thin layer of spongy bone that is found in the interior of the diaphysis. Most of the interior of the diaphysis is actually composed of this, it's a hollow cavity called the medullary cavity. Now, in living bone tissue, it's not actually empty. There's actually a material that fills that we'll look at in the next couple of minutes here. But as I mentioned previously, the interior of the epiphyses tends to be made of spongy bone. The exterior of the epiphyses tends to be a thin layer of compact bone here, whereas in the diaphysis, we don't really get a lot of spongy bone. So there's a little bit of spongy bone on the interior here, but not very much. Most of the diaphysis is made of these very thick walls of compact bone. And then in the very center of the diaphysis here, we have the medullary cavity. The epiphyses, kind of returning to those, we see the epiphyses are usually capped with thin layers of hyaline cartilage, and this thin layer of hyaline cartilage that's located here is usually called the articular cartilage. Now, articular cartilage functions to cushion the ends of this bone, or these bones, I should say, during movement, because this is where the joints with other bones are formed here, and so that articular cartilage is providing a protective cushioning as the bones glide over one another in the joint there. So as I mentioned a few minutes ago, the diaphysis of long bones typically contains a cavity called the medullary cavity. Now, this medullary cavity in dried preserved specimens we see is empty and hollow, but it is not empty in living bone tissue because it contains yellow bone marrow. Yellow bone marrow is primarily made of adipose tissue, so this is where bones store triglycerides within that adipose tissue. So this is primarily the triglyceride storage area of long bones here. Now, also because bones are extremely well vascularized, there are openings in the diaphysis of the long bones that are called the nutrient foramen that allow arteries and veins to pass into. So if it's an artery, it's going to be able to pass into the bone to deliver nutrients to the bone. Veins are going to be emerging from the bone, bringing blood back to the heart and carrying away wastes that any of the bone cells and tissues are making. So we see nutrient foramina as small cavities that allow the passageway of things like blood vessels. Now, also within the spongy bone of certain types of bones, we see because we just talked about yellow bone marrow, we see another type of bone marrow called red bone marrow. Red bone marrow's job is to produce blood cells. So this is the place where we see red blood cells and a number of white blood cells being produced as well. And so red bone marrow's job is to make blood cells. Red bone marrow does not have a uniform distribution across the body. Instead, it's only found in certain locations, and it's found in quite a few locations as well. So its distribution is not extremely limited in the body. We primarily find it in the spongy bone of the flat bones of the skull, the spongy bone that makes up the interior of the ribs and the sternum, the vertebrae as well. Pelvic bones also contain spongy bone in their center, and we see red bone marrow in there as well. And we also see it in the spongy bone of the proximal epiphyses of the humerus and the femur as well, which make up remember the humerus here is the bone of the arm, and the femur is the bone of the thigh here. And so we see red bone marrow being confined to the proximal epiphyses of those two bones there. So returning back to the surface features of bones, I want to highlight a structure here called the periosteum. Now, the periosteum is a white double-layered membrane that covers the superficial surface of all of our bones. So not just our long bones, right? Remember, our long bone here is just our example bone here. But it covers the superficial surface of all of our bones. The only thing that it does not cover are the joint surfaces where the articular cartilage is located. But anywhere where there's bone tissue and not articular cartilage, we're going to see on the superficial surface, we're going to see periosteum located on those bones. So the graphic that I made here, I'm hoping will help you kind of see how the periosteum is organized. We'll start with the superficial layer of periosteum here. It's called the fibrous layer. It's made out of dense irregular connective tissue, which is mostly collagen, and this collagen really helps provide a sturdy anchoring surface for things like tendons, ligaments, blood vessels, nerves, and things like that. So this provides a sturdy anchoring surface to which other structures can attach to on the surface of the bone here. So that's the fibrous layer. As we make our way inward towards the compact bone, which makes up the superficial surface of all of our bones, we see that between the fibrous layer and the compact bone that is sitting directly on the surface of the compact bone is a deep layer called the osteogenic layer, and it's made out of a couple of things. One of the principal cell types that it's made out of a layer of osteoprogenitor cells. So recall that those are the stem cells of bone that give rise to things like osteoblasts and osteocytes. But the osteogenic layer not only contains osteoprogenitor cells, it also contains osteoblasts, which are the bone-forming cells, and the osteoclasts, which are the bone breakdown cells. So we see those three cell types within the osteogenic layer of the periosteum. So I made this graphic here just because you can't see that there are two distinct layers in this diagram here. Much of the layer, I should say, here is made of this fibrous layer. So I've kind of drawn these out of proportion with one another. again here, the idea is just to show you how the periosteum is organized. Most of the periosteum, though, is going to be this fibrous layer of dense, irregular connective tissue. The osteogenic layer is a very thin layer that sits on the very superficial surface of the bone, between the compact bone and the fibrous layer. So I did draw those out of proportion. I just wanted to give you an idea of how they were organized there. So we also see that the periosteum contains these perforating fibers, which are bundles of collagen that actually extend into the bone tissue itself and help to anchor the periosteum to the superficial surface of the bone. Otherwise, the periosteum would not be very well attached to the superficial surface of that compact bone there. Now, if we turn our attention to the interior of our long bone here, the inner surface is actually lined with another type of tissue that we refer to as the endosteum. Now, the endosteum is pretty similar to the osteogenic layer of the periosteum, and you can see it here in this light micrograph here. So you see our compact bone, which makes up the wall of our long bone here. The endosteum is a thin layer of cells here that's situated between the compact bone and the yellow marrow, which fills the medullary cavity there. So this thin layer of endosteum contains the osteoprogenitor cells, just like we saw in the osteogenic layer of the periosteum, and it also contains osteoblasts and osteoclasts as well. So we see cells that are involved in building bone and breaking down bone, as well as the stem cells of bone. So hopefully what I've given you the impression of by now is that the external surface of bones are not smooth and featureless. Instead, they have really distinct markings, which we call bone markings on them, that tell us what kinds of structures attach to those bones or what kinds of structures pass through those bones. So what I'd like you to do here is in either your lecture textbook or your lab manual, I'd like you to review all of the projections that are these sites of muscle and ligament attachment here. So there's a couple of terms here and their description. I'd like you to review all of the projections that help form joints, and there's 4 of those here. The depressions and openings for passages of blood vessels and nerves, and there's 4 of those here as well as the other bone markings category, of which there are 3 of here. So you'll see that as we work through the skeleton in Chapter 7, we're going to encounter these terms again. So until we get to that point, I want you to practice naming the bone markings here. You don't have to be able to identify them from a diagram quite yet, but just make yourself familiar with the name of the bone marking and its description, because you're going to see these on both the lab quiz and the lecture exam.